Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. Today, we'll be learning about handling documents and data in multiple languages during litigation and ways to accelerate the discovery process when working across international borders or in multiple languages. Just quickly before we get started, all of your lines have been muted to reduce background noise, but please feel free to shoot us questions using the chat feature that should be on the lower right-hand side of everyone's screens. I see a few people are still joining, but we want to be mindful of everyone's time this morning. I know you've all set aside a full hour for us, and we very much appreciate that. So let's go ahead and get started. We have got a great roster of experts for this discussion today. My name is Sarah Brown, and I'll be your moderator. I've been working in the eDiscovery industry for more than 11 years and have worked in Hong Kong, London, and the US. We have also on the line today Dr. John Tinsley. Can you introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're in. My name is John Tinsley. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Iconic Translation Machines. We are a pure play translation software provider based out of Dublin, Ireland, where I am today, though we have offices in London and in Barcelona. We've been developing software specifically for the eDiscovery space for the last number of years, and it's kind of where my own background is as well in language technology. I have a PhD from Dublin City University in machine translation. Believe it or not, that's actually a thing that I got back in 2009. So this is basically what I do. I work with languages every day, and we develop software, and so we're really excited about speaking on this webinar today.
Thank you so much, Jerome.
I'm Jerome Torres-Lozano. I'm Director of Professional Services at Inventus, based in London. I've been at Inventus for nearly 3 years, and I advise international clients on their eDiscovery needs and the use of the appropriate technology in their legal matters. I have 18 years experience in the electronic evidence field, namely computer forensics and eDiscovery. And prior to that, I worked in translation and localization industry, which makes me Inventus a resident linguist.
Fantastic. Dominic?
Yeah, and bonjour und guten Tag from my side here. My name is Dominic Pinot. I'm in the Frankfurt office of the Inventus operations and data centers in Europe. I'm looking after our German and our French clients, and I've been with the company almost 3 years now as well, in the industry for almost 6 years, and I'm looking forward to a very international discussion today.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. Just quickly, we will be going through how translations and eDiscovery intersect, a few critical best practices for legal practitioners to know, humans versus machine translation and how the two can best work together, as well as some of the more pressing privacy and security issues involved in multinational litigation, and last but certainly not least, a few real-life case studies. And before I turn it over to our speakers, I just want to remind everyone that today's presentation will be recorded. So if you have to step away from your desk, don't worry, we will send out the full recording after the conclusion of today's live broadcast. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Well, thanks again for joining us on this webinar on the use of translation in eDiscovery. To kick off, this is a prediction from Gartner that says that 80% of litigation will be multilingual by 2020. This is not this is not surprising at all when you consider how business is conducted nowadays. Where many trade barriers have been lifted, and this is certainly the case within the EU. Where servicing clients in other countries is extremely common. And while you would argue that English is often the lingua franca or the de facto language of international business, business does tend to operate in the official language of the region, be it the language of the employees or the clients. A small example here at Inventus, we are a global company, and the language used to operate across offices is English. Dominic and I are both French speakers, and we communicate in French. So meaning that most of our, electronic correspondence is either in French or, any other language that we would actually use with, with our clients. Also, when you look at the internet at large, or internet content, the most predominant language again is English, with over 50%, I believe, of overall content. The remaining 50% is split across many other languages, Chinese and Spanish, I think, being in the top three. All of this, trickles down when companies are faced with legal action, and it's not surprising that the vast majority of matters that we handle, be it litigation, compliance, arbitration, have a multilingual aspect or component to them. And today we will discuss in more detail the use of translation and machine translation technology in this very process.
Yeah, and just echoing Jérôme's point there, even in Iconic, only 20%, even though we're predominantly based in English-speaking countries, only 20% of our employees are native English speakers, and so there's even in smaller companies, there's a real multilingual vibe going on. And so what you're seeing here is the second challenge that accompanies the multilingual challenge. Not only is a lot of litigation going to have a multilingual component going forward, there's going to be a lot more of it. So the amount of data there is online is growing at a 40% annual compound rate. We're looking here in 2019 that there are around 30 zettabytes of data, growing to 45 zettabytes by next year. And that's, just to give you a sense of what a zettabyte is, that's 45 billion terabytes. And so not only are we going to have to deal with foreign language, we're going to have to deal with a lot more foreign language. And perhaps the approaches we had in the past to deal with this are no longer going to scale. And that's what we're going to go into in a little bit more detail today, is how we can scale to meet not only the growing volume of content, but also the growing volumes of multilingual content.
A further challenge we see, especially from an international point of view, when it comes to where matters are based today and in the future, is that discovery is getting cross-border and multi-jurisdictional. Nearly 40% of all companies surveyed in 2019 by Statista reported involvement in cross-border litigation. Cross-border litigation, aside of data privacy, is a topic that puts a long list of requirements into the eDiscovery workflow, but also on the desks of our clients, because especially in Europe, with a lot of languages we speak here and a lot of ways to interact with our clients on the continent, but also with our companies around the world, well, we see that multilingual, but also multi-jurisdictional cases and matters are on the rise. Not only because of changes in ways like competition law, where competition law enforcement or class actions are hitting more and more the European companies and the European countries, but also think of the example of international arbitration, where, for example, in this study here, 67% of the respondents said that they had been involved in the past year. That said, the raise, or let's say the amount of languages we'll see in the data sets in the future are certainly growing, but also it's putting a bit of a level of complexity into the cases and the strategy. We'll come to examples on how to handle that in next seconds and slides. As an example here, when we speak about translation and eDiscovery, we feel, and we separated, let's say, two use cases. One is incidental, when things are starting and coming up from time to time. It's maybe a low volume and you're creating your case. It's early stage of the investigation or the eDiscovery process. You recognize a mix of languages and some snippets of text and some single documents and some maybe single custodians being in some foreign languages. And this is the point where we feel that machine translation and translation eDiscovery will help you identifying, in a way of early case assessment, how to set up the next actions, the next steps, and the case team, but also potentially how to set up the review for the collections and how you may have to handle translations and on-the-spot translations, making sure you're gathering the right information right at the beginning when it comes to the defensibility, but also to the collection log. And then on the other side, there's a known quantity of documents or information based on a project, for example, a certain case or an M&A transaction that is a project that is potentially running for years or months already. And now you're at the point where you need to disclose, transfer, or even just translate data that, flew back from some of the reviews, some of your teams, where you know that you have a large volume of files on different formats, maybe even different file types that need to go into a harmonized language world so that you can, generate reports, making sure you're presenting the right information to, for example, the disclosure or the court.
Yeah, and I think, so on the right-hand side here in the projects and cases, this is really what we're going to be addressing kind of going forward over the rest of this webinar. On the left-hand side with incidental cases, these are things that you might be able to resolve with kind of ad hoc processes. However, as things scale in larger matters, this is when we need to kind of have a more locked down workflow in terms of how we're going to process this information. So let's look at what options you have when you come across larger volumes of foreign language information. So we've broken them down into four, as we typically see in the industry across our various clients, across Inventus's clients. The first option, and this is quite disturbing and, and one that clients have told us they often do, is do nothing with the foreign language information. Let's see if we can work in our existing process with the English language content and maybe make a decision and ultimately push the multilingual content to the side. It's there, it's an option. We don't necessarily recommend it. But again, as the volumes grow, that won't be feasible to do. The second option is, again, a little bit more ad hoc. It's to look internally. Does anyone in the firm, does anyone in the company speak the language we're dealing with, and can they assist with review and with translation? The third option, and which is probably the most common option, is to hire contract reviewers in the language, so they're bilingual between the, let's say, English and the foreign language, and can work directly with the files in those languages. And then the last option is translating the documents from the foreign language into English, we'll call it the target language, and then doing the review in those languages. So let's take a look at what the respective pros and cons are of these options. So for the first one, I guess a little bit flippantly, it's quite obvious what the pros and cons are. So yes, if you have someone internally who can look at the documents, it's quick and it's effective, but it's not going to scale. If there's any serious volume of documents, your internal colleague's not going to be able to handle it. It's not guaranteed. Let's say I need some French document reviews. Maybe Jerome can help me out with the review, but maybe Jerome is out of the office, or maybe he's in a meeting, or I don't know where he is. So it's not guaranteed that he's going to be there. And then in terms of the languages that are going to be covered, yes, you might be lucky and you might cover some in the office, but really you're not going to cover the breadth of languages that you're potentially going to increase. So we don't really see this as any sort of kind of a consistent option. It's really more of one of the ad hoc options. I'm going to let Jerome talk in a little bit more detail about the option of using contract reviewers.
Yes, as the chart describes, I think that the most effective way of review, we're not talking about translation here, but review of multilingual documents in eDiscovery is the use of, or having these reviewed by native contract reviewers. The aim of review is to determine the relevancy of a document in a legal matter. Translation, be it human or machine translation, does not do that. So one could then ask why or in which context of review would translation come into play. And typically I would say that after the relevance of a foreign language document has been determined by a reviewer, be it internal at a law firm or external, whether when the document is considered to be relevant or hot, then at that particular time you may want to consider machine translation, translating the document in the language of the legal counsel. That way, that the translated document will accompany the original document or the source document throughout the process, and it will provide context to the legal teams, and the legal teams or counsel will have the ability to have access to the native original document as well as the translated form if needed at any point in the process.
Yeah, and if I then move on to elaborate on the kind of the human translation side of things, and I know it sounds really awkward to call it human translation, but we'll go with that. We might call it professional translation in a little bit. So again, we assume that this is quite an effective approach, although that is an assumption that we do need to be careful with, because humans can make mistakes too, and especially one of the challenges we see in litigation is the idea of subject matter expertise. So you're going to be dealing with companies across a variety of different industries. One case could be oil and gas, the other could be financial services, and there'll be lots of technical terms in there. And when procuring translation, you need to make sure that the actual individuals who are doing the translation do have subject matter expertise in that area. So I mean, that's the pro, is that you're assuming we're getting a more effective translation here, but there are cons with this side as well. So number one is it's quite slow. So firstly, you have to procure the translation or the vendor, then you have to actually do the translation, and even after all that, you haven't still done the review, so you still have the review to do. Secondly, it's quite expensive, so translation is typically charged on a per word basis, and so if you have any serious volume of documents, the costs are going to rise quite quickly. And then lastly, again, it doesn't scale quite well, so if you have a large volume of information that you need processed in a short space of time, the only way to do that is to throw people at it, and the more people you throw at these things, the more the cost goes up. But all of that doesn't speak to the fact that at this stage in the process, a human translation might be overkill. It might be gilding the lily to some extent, because do we really need a human certified translation at this point, or do we need a translation that's effective to allow us to make a decision as to whether something is relevant or not? So this is, I guess, where we talk about the other translation options aside from humans, looking at machine translation as well. So if we move on, we can look at perhaps what the three translation options are. So what we were just describing there was what we'll call professional human translation. The next option is our kind of free online machine translation tools, which might be the first thing that come to people's minds when we're talking about machine translation. But obviously we want to introduce the third aspect here, which is what we call professional machine translation, the likes of which obviously ourselves and Iconic develop, and Inventus and some other companies actually use. So let's maybe run through the pros and cons considering those three options here. So again, we just talked about, amongst the translation options, we might consider that the human translation will give us the best quality. Though again, as we said, it's slow, it's expensive, and it doesn't scale. If we look at the online machine translation tools, obviously they have the benefit of speed, which is the main motivation for any sort of automation, and they're cheap as well. So they're not all totally free, but they can be quite cheap as well. However, they have quite a number of limitations. Actually going to go from the bottom up here. The bottom one is there are limitations around where you can integrate it, what sort of file formats they can deal with, how they produce the output, and what format you need to work with that in. The second question is quality. So these are kind of one size fits all software. They're not adapted for any particular use case. So if you're using it on a legal document, this is the same machine translation software that someone is going to use to translate a menu in Chinese or a hotel review in some other language. But then the last, and I guess most important point here around these tools is information security. What's actually happening to the data, where it's being processed. And for the most part, in the large majority of the cases, this is what rules out these tools being a kind of effective solution in this case. And so that's when we move to professional machine translation, and which we feel kind of perhaps gives the best balance between all of these questions. So firstly, it's quick, it's automated translation, it's cost effective, so it's not free, but it's very in line with kind of exactly what you need and the value that it's actually offering to the end user. It's flexible in terms of how it can be integrated. We're going to talk a little bit about this later on, but we can integrate it via APIs into workflows, into tools like relativity, and kind of where the back end is deployed. And that's what also allows us to ensure very transparent information security. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit in terms of security. But the last point is there around quality. Perhaps that's a con, but we don't really believe so, because machine translation has evolved to such an extent today that it's producing translations for the most part that are more than fit for purpose to be able to make a determination as to whether a document is relevant to your case or not, as to whether perhaps you do need to invest into the certified translation. So before we kind of move on a little bit, I want to come back to the topic of security and maybe allow the Jerome and Dom at Inventus to kind of elaborate a little bit more on the topic of security here.
Yeah, there were one point here that I wanted to make, John, specifically on the online machine translation, and I think that this is simply not an option in a legal matter. We would certainly, as you said, we would certainly not advise it, especially in terms of security and data privacy. Sending client data over the internet to be translated, could violate tons of data, privacy regulations, expose clients to security and data breaches or breach risk. So, I even remember, back in the day, maverick discovery outfits that would actually, use Google Translate in order to machine translate documents for their clients. And I believe that these crazy practices are now over, but I think for me the online machine translation is certainly a non-starter. Going a tiny bit away, on the wayside in terms of security, wanted to talk about human translation. I also wanted to say that in the context of eDiscovery, human translation is seldomly used, and you've explained the reasons why. The reasons again are quite simple. That in a document review, it's typically composed of a large volume of documents that need to be reviewed and reviewed quickly. So the low speed, the lack of scalability, as you've mentioned, the high cost of human translation, and sometimes the limited subject matter expertise or knowledge, at that early stage in a process is counterintuitive, and the only time that I've really seen a human translation being used, more often than not, is when producing documents to the courts or to the other side, if it's been agreed that way, that the documents would be human translated. And as you mentioned, at that point, a certified translation is the norm.
Speaking about security, and this is something we underline here, especially with the view on data privacy, GDPR, transfers of data, PII, and everything that goes into the European way of handling, information that are not allowed to leave countries or company sites or even data centers. Having a professional machine translation system in a backbone, like in the Inventus data center or on-site in the network of the client, is something that we'll show you in the next couple of minutes. But it's the ultimate answer on data privacy, but also on security, especially thinking about some of the key industries here in Europe, like automotive or chemistry, where a lot of the information that goes into a machine translation system could potentially be something that is also IP relevant. And I'm sure, John, you will cover that point in the next couple of minutes as well. But just think about where you're implementing a professional machine translation from architecture, but also from a hosting, but also from a security standpoint.
Great. Yeah, and so we'll definitely come back to touch on that in a little bit detail later on. But so I guess we've talked about this as if it's a question of one or the other, as if it's a question of, you know, this dichotomy of humans versus machines. But as Jerome described, it's about using the right tool for the job. It's about using what's fit for purpose at any particular point in time. So at kind of early case assessments or kind of as we're going through doing the review, we're dealing with large volumes. We need a quick fit for purpose translation, and that's where machine translation comes in. But then there are, you know, later on in the process, when we're producing documents for a court, we strictly need a human translation. So as opposed to it being that kind of false dichotomy of humans versus machines, we're really talking about a combined approach with humans and machines, and Jerome described that quite well. And I guess that's what we're talking about today, you know, in terms of how we work with Inventus. The idea there is to provide that full end-to-end range of services using automation and using people, so using the right kind of tool at the right stage in the job. I don't know, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more, Jerome, or have we covered it off?
I mean, I completely agree. I think that, as you said, you know, you might think that these are completely opposed, solutions and are mutually exclusive, but they are not. And as I said before, and as you've mentioned, in an eDiscovery context, that there is a time and place for all these options. You might want to use machine translation in an ECA scenario, an early case assessment, to get a gist of the content of the data at an early stage. You might want to reserve machine translation to translate relevant and hot documents after a first level review has completed. And again, so that you give counsel access to the translated document for context. So there's different times and different moments when those technologies and human and technology can be used in this context.
Great. So I think it's now time to get into the weeds a little bit. So I mentioned very briefly a few minutes ago that machine translation is good enough in the vast majority of cases to produce fit for purpose translations for the purpose of making judgments on documents. If you've ever used machine translation in the past, you will know that this was not always the case. Machine translation has evolved quite a lot over its lifetime, relatively short lifetime, to the point that it has only recently become a very, very viable solution, not only in eDiscovery, but it's now being widely used across a variety of different industry verticals and enterprises. So I want to give you a brief story as to how that has actually come about. So I'm going to take you all the way back to the late 40s to talk about kind of when machine translation was first invented. And it was actually invented during a collaboration between Georgetown and IBM in the early 50s. And what they were doing was developing software to translate between Russian and English. So I'll leave it up to you to guess why that was of interest back in the 50s. And so this technology was known as rule-based machine translation. So it was basically teams of linguists writing rules to decide how do you convert Russian into English, and then using dictionaries basically to do the transformation between the words. So that was how it started off. Everyone was really excited, and there was a report that said this problem will be solved in 3 years. Needless to say, it wasn't. There was a subsequent report came out in the 60s called ALPAC, which you see there, which basically said this technology is dead, stop funding it. And that's exactly what happened for about 20 years until we had a success case, which was called a system called Meteo, which, as the name might suggest, it was translating weather forecasts between French and English in Canada. And it worked very well because there's only so many ways you can describe the weather, even here in Ireland. And so it was able to kind of really focus and produce what we call a very domain-specific machine translation system. And that kind of started research building up in machine translation again, to the point in the early 90s where we had a paradigm shift. So this again originated from IBM, and this is when we moved from doing machine translation with rules to using statistics and early versions of machine learning, basically to take large amounts of previously translated content and develop algorithms to learn from that to translate new types of content. And things ran along like that for over 20 years and got a little bit more sophisticated, moving from translating words to translating phrases to adding in linguistic information. But we had really kind of by, let's say 2013, 2014, we'd kind of plateaued in terms of how good the machine translation was. So there were certain languages we could do, certain languages we couldn't do, but we kind of hit the ceiling until we had a big kind of breakthrough, and we're not really hyping it anymore because it's after meeting its expectations. And this was the machine translation going along with the AI wave that we're seeing across all sorts of technologies at the moment. And this is what we call neural machine translation. So it's basically using artificial intelligence to teach neural networks how to translate between two languages. And like I said, it's had a transformative effect on how well machine translation can work and how broadly it can now be applied. And I can give a couple of anecdotes. I know Jerome can give some examples of kind of bad experiences that he's had with machine translation. If you want to tell us some of those stories, Jerome.
Yeah, it reminds me of one experience I had, back in the early days of machine translation. It was a Japanese matter, and where the main protagonist was Mr. Suzuki, and it appeared time and time again in the documents, and the system would translate Mr. Suzuki into Mr. Seabass or Mr. Trout. I don't remember. So the system was at the time was unable to differentiate the between the family name and the common word. So each instance of the name needed to be manually overwritten or changed. And nowadays, as you've mentioned, with neural translation, this misinterpretations don't happen, or if they do, then they can be easily rectified, and the system can be taught.
Yeah, exactly. And as a machine translation developer, I always cringe at those examples, as real as they might be. They kind of reflect on the software that we're working on. But like from our perspective, the impact that this shift to neural machine translation has had has been really transformative. We used to categorize languages internally in terms of how doable they were. So there were certain languages like, let's say, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, which were on the easier end of the scale, and we knew that we could develop pretty good machine translation for them. But at the other end of the scale, we had languages like Japanese and even more complex languages like Turkish and Hungarian and Finnish, whereby if we had a client who wanted translation in those languages, we pretty much had to hold our hands up and say, I don't think we can do something like that. That's gone away now. We don't have that problem anymore. So it's less a case of looking at where can we use the machine translation, where is it good enough to use, as to looking very broadly across all sorts of applications and use cases and saying, how can we apply machine translation in here, because we know that it's good enough, and eDiscovery is clearly one of those areas. And if we move on, I think that it goes to show in the range of languages that we support in our technology that Inventus make available also, there are languages here that we would not have had in a list of supported languages 4 years ago, and if they were there, certainly the quality of the translations would not have been tremendously high. And that being said, it's still not all things equal across all languages. There are, when we talk about how effective the machine translation is going to be, there are two factors that influence the quality of the machine translations, and one of those is the language. So there are languages that are still more challenging. Asian languages like Chinese, Japanese, and Korean will always be a little bit more challenging than let's say some European languages. But probably in eDiscovery, the biggest factor that can influence the quality of machine translations is the quality of the documents that we're actually translating. So if we're translating emails, Microsoft Word documents, clean, machine readable input, then the likelihood that you're going to get a good translation out of there, a usable translation, are high. But if we're dealing with nasty scanned PDFs or handwritten languages, they're the areas where it's still going to be trickier, and that's why we do have those fallback options of using human translations where we have something critical and we do need to get over a hump. So we've talked a lot about kind of what your options are and kind of what we do from a technology perspective and how we can incorporate people into the process when we need to. So let's maybe Dom can talk us through a little bit about how between what we do and what Inventus do, how we actually deliver that as a solution to end users.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, John. So I think key to understand is that between the service provider, Inventus, and Iconic as the provider of the translation software, we have a variety of deployment options. First of all, the way you access the machine and the system is, something that you can select depending on the case requirements, but as well on the client requirements. It's integral part of our managed service offerings in the sense of any instance that we define as a managed service instance would have Iconic translation machines integrated into that. So it's pretty easy to enable that on your workspace, on your full relativity instance, or even on a different way of enhancing the system, means on data, structured data, unstructured data. But also due to its platform connector into relativity, we have a full administrative access to it and can, also control who will get access. We can control the metrics, we can control the access rights, but also the way of accessing workspaces from different countries or jurisdictions. Just remembering about data privacy, what that may have effects as well. Then lastly, on the way to use it, there is a web app, which is kind of a clean application where you guys can principally start doing machine translation on the spot. And that's the easiest way of, translating single documents, but also, let's say an easy way of starting machine translation with some documents, maybe a medium-sized data set, and that's outside of the relativity instance, for example. When it comes to the technology and the way we deploy the instances, then we certainly have the usual deployment options you may know from especially all the relativity instances we have, like a cloud/SaaS model that could be our on-premise, our private cloud system in one of our data centers around the world, like Frankfurt, like Hong Kong, like the United States or the United Kingdom, but also part of the Relativity One implementation. On-premise, that means we would put the system behind the firewall of the law firm or the corporation, which is something that is a bit tricky when it comes to the technology requirements that the client may need, but it's the ultimate answer on, technology, scalability, and security. And then for projects that may run into some data privacy blocking statutes, but also some, very confidential reasons why the project cannot happen in one of the data centers, one of the SaaS options, the managed services, or even in the client premises, well, then we call it a mobile solution, which is basically, as we designed it here, something that you can put on a plane with a guy or with someone of our team flying to a place like we had before, to the Bahamas, where something on a project basis happened, and the machine translation system is then incorporated into the mobile toolkit that is based on relativity.
Yeah, and so I think what this goes to show is that, I alluded to this earlier on when talking about, for example, one of the differences between professional machine translation and online machine translation is the flexibility and as you can see, what we're doing here is we're not just providing machine translation saying, right, go and use this, work out how to use it yourself. We're providing an end-to-end solution. So on the left, you have all the different ways in which you can access the translations, and on the right are all the different ways, essentially, in which you can control where your information goes. And as you can imagine, in this industry, as a provider of a cloud service, security and data privacy is a question that comes up quite a lot. So I can speak a little bit to this about at least how we do it at Iconic and how the Inventus team leverage it. So the first thing to point out, if we pop over to the next slide, is where the information is actually processed. So at Iconic, we run our cloud platform on Amazon Web Services, and we have the ability, for example, to use relativity parlance on a workspace by workspace basis to configure where the information is actually processed. So the places, the orange circles that you see on your screen there are places where Amazon has data centers, and you can configure that where the information flows in one of those workspaces. So for instance, our default data center is based in Dublin, Ireland, in the EU, and you could have that as your default setting, but then you could specify on a matter by matter basis to process the information in the UK, in Germany, in Brazil, in the US, depending on what you require. And then on top of that, I guess the second question is, what happens to my data when I send it? Because with online tools, they'll often retain your data, use them for training their models. And even if some of the bigger providers provide options that say they don't do that, that's, it's still something that will not be bespoke for you. It's kind of an off-the-shelf policy, and you kind of take it or leave it. What we do is we have a very clear non-retention policy. So when something comes to our cloud servers, it happens over a secure connection. We process the information, and as soon as you have it back in your relative instance, nothing is retained on our side. And actually, that processing is even done on ephemeral servers that are only spun up, dedicated for your user. And once they're finished with the translations and spun down, any trace of any information that was on those servers is gone. And I won't claim to enjoy doing information security reviews, but our company does them all of the time, and it's just it's a part of the job in this industry. And I guess Dom can probably talk a little bit about how we were put through the ringer by Inventus security before they took us on board as well. Yeah,
absolutely, which was a big topic for all of us, especially when it came to the due diligence of what's in the box in Iconics, and also around security, data privacy. Not only for us to understand how data is handled secure, but also to keep in line with our data certifications like ISO 27001 and any of the other frameworks and regulations that would require us to be really diligent when it comes to handling data, especially for our clients. And the good news here is that we found this scalability of the machine translation backbone with Iconic that is so great that we can scale it up on a big CPU, high compute power environment that can process a lot of data in a really, really quick way when it comes to whatever, a terabyte of data, a lot of pages, or some language that needs to be translated quickly, because that's something we have ready in our data centers, or even overlapping to the Iconic backbone. But then also to really, really sensitive cases. Think of, for example, an automotive company in Germany that has a really, really deep technology wording in such document sets, where the client is really scared of, for some reasons, losing that translation know-how to the World Wide Web, because don't forget that some of our clients see the technology, but they may not understand what's in the box in the background. That said, in all of our discussions with the team here in the group here, we made clear and made sure that all of the certifications, but also all of the required IT security measurements are in place, and so we can say it's ready to go.
Awesome. So I think at this stage, maybe we can take a look at, so we've talked about all these workflows and things like that, but maybe we can take a look at a couple of examples of how we've used this kind of machine and human translation in collaboration with our software and Inventus' services to deliver solutions to the end client.
Yeah, I think, John, this one is one of the early cases where Iconic wasn't integrated in our instance of relativity at the time. So text files were actually sent over directly to Iconic for machine translation. This was a large case. We're talking about 3.5 million documents being processed. Of which 300,000 documents were identified for review, and with over 10% of Russian document in the data set. Council had, in this particular instance, had decided to have all the documents identified through processing. So when we use automatic language identification to identify that the language or languages contained in the documents. So all the documents that were identified as Russian or predominantly Russian were, to be machine translated. And while the law firm had an internal team of native speakers reviewing the original documents for relevancy, they wanted to have the documents translated for context, so that the rest of the legal team at large, could have access to the translated document at all times. However, I think that the difference here is that they went to a human translated at production time. They had pre-agreed with the other side, with the opposing side, to have the disclosable set or disclosable documents human translated. In this particular case, there was no requirement to have them done by a certified translator or translators. So they were simply sent to a translation agency, which were provided also with the with the machine translated copies. So it kind of accelerated the process. So you can see here the different interaction between the different systems and the different teams, and while using this type of technology. The next one. Is a smaller case. I think well, smaller. It was still over a million documents processed. A population of around 75,000 documents were identified for review. And this time, less than 10% of multilingual documents. In this particular case, as opposed to the one before, Inventus actually performed the relevancy review. So we had a team of native speakers that would actually review the multilingual documents, or most of them, and the rest or the remainder of the data would actually be reviewed by English-speaking reviewers. In this particular case, because of the fragmentation of the data, there were over 20 odd languages, and the most relevant documents were expected to be in English, and also the fact that the U.S. law firm had very limited in-house language capabilities. Again, it was decided that all 6,000 documents would actually be translated prior to be reviewed by native speakers. There was again no requirements in this particular case for documents to be human translated, but the council in the US wanted to have the documents translated, so they could have they could prepare their strategy and again have access to the translated document in second level review. So again, this is a typical example of having the documents reviewed by native speakers, and you have to remember that reviewers are not translators, so they certainly should not translate documents. Also if you take the golden rule of translation from my translation days, translators need to be translated into their mother tongue. Because obviously they will understand that the nuances of their language much better than the source language or the target language. So this is another example of the application of machine translation alongside review. There was again no particular need to have those documents translated, as relevance in this case revolved around English documents, but it was easier to translate all documents at the start and have them reviewed by native speakers for most of the languages that were encountered. There were some languages, if I recall, that had a small amount of documents, and those were clearly relevant by context, but were reviewed then in English. But I would say that in that particular case, it was the exception. John, I guess this is what you have seen, I guess, in terms of the application of MT in eDiscovery and legal matters.
Yeah, pretty much. Like I say, as we've seen, there are multiple kind of ways in which kind of multilingual information can be handled and where the machine translation can be fit in, and these are two great examples of that. I guess from our experience being at the coal face of the translation side of things, the only kind of predictable factor in any of these projects is how unpredictable they are, and particularly in terms of, you know, the volume of files, the languages, and the file formats and things like that. So in the first half of this year, so January through the end of June, we translated slightly over 500 million words of foreign language content into English across 33 different languages. There were only 2 requests we had from prospective users where we didn't support the language. I think one was an African language and one was a Central Asian language. So like I said, there's a lot of unpredictability. You know, in other industries, there might be languages that are more consistent. You know, in the pharmaceutical industry, we might be dealing more with Chinese and Japanese and certain European languages. But like I said, in eDiscovery, the only predictable factor is we have no idea what we might see tomorrow. So just keeping an eye on the clock, this looks like we're just about on time. Maybe just to kind of a couple of take homes for you in order to wrap up. I guess the first thing there is, you know, multilingual litigation and multilingual regulatory inquiries, they're here to stay. They're not going anywhere. You can't really avoid them anymore. But you know, the good thing is that you have a variety of options on how to handle this, as we've seen, as we've described over the course of this webinar, and as Jerome ran through a couple of examples there. You really shouldn't ignore the translation needs, because there's no need to ignore them, because you have these options, and the more effective a solution you have, you know, especially if you can get translation technology into your technology stack as a default, you'll be able to handle things more effectively if you're able to be more proactive in kind of being ready for this rather than being reactive. And obviously the point we want to hammer home is that, you know, between what we offer from a technology perspective, translation technology perspective, excuse me, at Iconic, and what the team at Inventus offers in terms of bringing all of those pieces of technology together, and then adding the workflows and the services on top of that, I think we pretty much have you all covered.
Yeah, and before wrapping up this session today, and to facilitate for you the experience of the good collaboration between Inventus and Iconic, and as a thank you for attending this webcast, we are offering you each 100 free pages of machine translation for your next multilingual eDiscovery project. This will enable you to test or use 100 free pages of translation in your next Inventus project. For those of you that work with us, already work with us, if you have a multilingual matter, just think of us. And also, this offer is valid in the next 3 months for any new matter, and we can offer 100 free pages. This offer is also valid until the 1st October, but please do look for an email with an offer enclosed the next couple of days.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Last but definitely not least, you know, we've got just a few minutes left here, so I'd love to go through some of the questions that have been popping up in the questions module. Let's see, we've got, I think, it's about 7 minutes left. So this is actually a question that came up from a number of you, which is how exactly is this priced, you know, for a large scale machine translation project? Is it a document count, volume count, page count? And Jerome, that sounds like a good question for you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, the typical, I mean, in eDiscovery, the vast majority of costs are calculated in gigabyte unit. In translation, or in the translation world, human translation is per word. In the world of machine translation is per page. So what we basically do is that once documents are ready for for translation, we would convert them so we wouldn't have a page number or count, and then we would be able to kind of give an estimate to the client. So there's a unit cost per page. Obviously, depending on requirements and translation needs, we can look at other ways of pricing it. But the most typical one is on a page basis.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So the next question I've seen, and this is one that came up 3 times, I think, is can you explain what exactly happens to our data when we send it to the machine translation cloud? I think a lot of people have concerns about that. John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, let me take that one. So yeah, I kind of touched on it briefly earlier on, but I'll give a little bit more detail. So essentially, let's say you've got our application configured in your Relativity workspace. You can, like I said, as part of that configuration, you can point to a particular data center. So let's say it's pointing to your data center in London. What happens is then within Relativity, you select the documents you want to translate, and you hit the translate button. So that will either specify the language or have it auto detect the language. So our API will do the language detection, and it says, okay, we're going from German into English. That sends a request to our Amazon web servers in London, and that for your user, so let's call it user A, that starts up a dedicated server instance running our German to English machine translation software. The information goes over a secure connection, so over HTTPS, to that dedicated instance. So that is uniquely spun up for your user. If another user requests a German to English translation at the same time, they get a dedicated instance as well. That instance then does all of the work. It does the processing of the translations. And once the translations are done on a file by file basis, they're sent back into Relativity and they are deleted from that server. And then finally, as a kind of a second measure to make sure that all data is expunged, once that process of translating those files has been completed, that server is spun down or turned off, and any sort of information that was on the server is gone completely. The only thing that we record is writing to the logs that says, user A translated X files from German to English, so that you have that information in your user interface for billing, but no data is retained after that.
Awesome, thank you so much. We have time for a couple more, and the next question is, how quickly could I use this as a client? How long is the ramp-up time or setup time for an initial or first translation project?
That is a great question, Sarah. Let me pick that. I think, as we mentioned earlier in today's session, the systems are up and running, the technologies are ready. So usually we would say, as at the point you have a Relativity connectivity in one of our workspaces, you can basically start, right? Certainly it depends a bit on the amount of data that needs to go into the system, but I would say on a client basis with Inventus, if you already collaborate with us, then I'm sure that is something we can turn around within the day or two, depending, as said, on the data size and the amount of documents. But usually it wouldn't take us too long to set this workspace up and potentially create the requirements for the project and the case, and then you guys are good and up and running with the machine translation.
Awesome, thanks. I think we have time for just one more. This is one from Jim. What are your thoughts on MT/PE as another option for eDiscovery where quality is important?
Let me take that one. So just to maybe explain, MT is machine translation and PE is post-editing. And so this is the process within the translation industry of first getting a machine translation as an initial draft and then having a human, again, this word human, or having an individual translator editing that and bringing it up to the final level of quality. That's another piece of the workflow where we see that fitting is still on that piece of the workflow where you need that like 100% guaranteed, perhaps certified level of translation quality. For the high volume case, during review, during early case assessment, the machine translation will be good enough in the very, very, very vast majority of the cases, unless, like I said, we have some issues with the file format or something like that. But then after that, if we want to have a little more assurance on the quality or we want to produce something in court, that's when we need the human translation. And in terms of producing that human translation, post-editing, the machine translation output is a very is a very good option as well. And actually, a lot of the human translation companies will use some form of machine translation in the background to facilitate that as well.
Great. So that is about all of the time we have questions for today. My apologies if we weren't able to get to your question. One of our speakers will definitely reach out to you to make sure that we do get all your questions answered. Just as a final reminder, everyone who spoke today's contact information is up on your screen, and we will be sending out the recording of this presentation. So if you had to step away, you can review it, you can share it with colleagues. Thank you very, very much to our presenters, and thank you for everyone who attended today. We appreciate your time.